Greetings, everybody. I want to talk about the federal budget for just a few minutes. Hopefully, I decided this was one last thing I wanted us to go through to look at. I just want you to get a sense of some of the numbers that we're looking at and making sure we can put those numbers into context. All right. So I'm going along with the PowerPoint here. And the first, real slide number 2, is large numbers, big numbers. The federal government will spend roughly, now I should say all these numbers are roughly numbers, let's say give or take roughly $200 billion or so. We'll know at the end of the year exactly where we're at for a lot of these, but roughly $4 trillion. The federal government this year will spend roughly $4 trillion. 2.5 trillion on that is on mandatory spending. I'll talk about in a second. 1.2 trillion is on discretionary spending, and 0.2 trillion dollars is on interest on the debt. 0.2 trillion meaning 200 to, I don't know which way. 1 second. Alright, so roughly 0.25 trillion, 1.2 trillion, and 0.2 trillion on mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and interest on the debt, respectively. You do the math, that's roughly 3.9 trillion, and I of course said we'll spend roughly $4 trillion. There's where some of the rounding and, whatever comes into play. The fact of the matter is, being $150 billion off when you're looking at $4 trillion isn't a big deal. Alright, so I said mandatory and discretionary spending. What are these things? Okay, so mandatory spending is spending that is set each year based upon previous law or previous law. It's spending that automatically adjusts based upon the needs and conditions, social and economic, that exist in the country. Social Security is an example of mandatory spending. Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, food stamps, these are issues of mandatory spending. The idea here is that there is a formula that the government uses that's been established through previous law that, a certain amount of money is just always automatically spent depending on the conditions. So when we had the economic recession in 2008, 2009, 2010, nobody had to pass a law saying, oh crap, we need to spend more money on unemployment insurance. It just automatically kicked in. It's just, if more people lose their jobs, they get unemployment insurance. These are also entitlement programs, all right? The idea with entitlement programs is that everybody is paid into them, so everybody gets to take something out of them when they need it. Everybody is paid into the Social Security system, so when you retire, you get to take money out of the Social Security system. And that spending there is, again, mandatory in the sense that Congress doesn't say, okay, this year we're budgeting $900 billion for Social Security. It's, no, this year there are 59 million people that are retired, and according to our Social Security pension formula, this is how much each person should get, so that's how much Social Security spends. It's the way that works. Just like in times where there's good economic growth, Unemployment insurance is very low. It's not like people went around and said, all right, we only probably need to budget X amount of dollars because we don't expect that many people to be unemployed this year. It just doesn't spend a lot of money. When economic times are bad and there's high unemployment, then unemployment insurance naturally increases. Okay, so then there's discretionary spending. Discretionary spending are things like the Department of Defense, Department of Education, Housing and Urban Development, Department of State, National Park Service, Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, Health and Human Services, a bunch of other things. A lot of those executive branch agencies or departments that you would generally think of. Those are discretionary spending. Now, what we mean by discretionary spending here is that this is spending that needs to be set each year under a new budget or under a new spending authorization bill. Okay, so let's see. There isn't a formula that says, all right, this upcoming year we're going to spend, X number of dollars on the defense budget. It's each year Congress looks at what needs to happen, what new projects are coming down the pipeline, what the base situation looks like, what the world military situation thing looks like, and says, okay, we're going to spend this amount of money on defense. Lots of times, generally, Congress will plan out 10-year budgets, so we have an idea of where we expect spending to go over the next 10 years. So there is long-term planning there. However, each individual year, depending on the circumstances, Congress can authorize spending of more or less than what the budget originally called for. So this is year-to-year spending authorization, whereas the mandatory spending, it's already set by law as part of, entitlement programs, as part of our social contract with each other. Where does the government get its money? A couple places. Biggest area is personal income tax, $1.6 trillion it takes in income tax. It takes in $1.1 trillion in payroll tax, so this is your Social Security and your Medicare taxes. It takes in $0.3 trillion or $300 billion in corporate income tax, way lower than it used to be. And there are other taxes and fees, excise taxes and things like that, equaling roughly $0.3 trillion, again, $300 billion that the government takes in. Now here's where the big numbers get super scary for lots of people. Okay? I should do this the other way around. It's on my slide. The federal deficit right now is going to be roughly $500 billion. The federal debt held by the public is roughly $14 trillion. Okay? So what is the debt and what is the deficit? The deficit is how much money the government brings in minus the amount of money the government spends. So if you bring in $100, but you spend $200, you'll have a deficit of -1. I don't even know if you can see that anymore. $100, -$100. That's the deficit. It's year to year. So let's say I make $10,000 this year, but I spend $11,000. I've got a deficit of $1,000 this year. Let's say next year I also make $10,000 and I spend $11,000 again. I got a deficit now of $1,000 this year and $1,000 next year. When you add those two together, you get $2,000, and that would be my debt. The debt is the overall amount of money that you or the government owes. So the deficit measures year to year how much you're spending versus you're bringing in. If you have a deficit, you're spending more than you bring in. If you have a surplus, then you're spending less than you bring in. The debt, though, is the total amount of money that you owe. So kind of take every year's deficit and surplus, add them all together, and that's how much your debt is. So this upcoming year in 2016, we're probably going to have a federal deficit of about $500 billion. Having a deficit of $500 billion will mean that roughly $500 billion will be added on to the federal debt, which is $14 trillion now. So at the end of the 2016 fiscal year, we might be looking at a federal debt of $14.5 trillion. Okay? So, before we faint at the fact that the federal government owes $14 trillion, let's consider numbers in context. Numbers are big or small relative to other numbers, or at least that's the way you have to look at them in this context. Okay, so a good example might be in Zimbabwe, a hamburger, let's say you're going to the dollar menu at McDonald's. Okay, in Zimbabwe, the official exchange rate, as of 2007 at least, according to what I just looked up online, a $1 burger at the McDonald's $1 value menu, whatever, would cost $30,000. Whoa, right? That's crazy. The thing, though, is that's $30,000 in Zimbabwe dollars. $30,000 in Zimbabwe dollars is equal to $1 in America. So while 30,000 is a larger number than 1, right? The fact of the matter is, in this case, they're actually more equally to each other. 30,000 is not, in reality, more than 1 when it comes to this currency situation. We got to think of the federal debt and the federal deficit in kind of the same way. The numbers are big, but are they really big? When you're dealing with big numbers, overall, even a number seems big. If another number is bigger, then that number really isn't that big. So here's what I mean. Another example maybe, let's say you owe you right there, you watching this right now. Yeah, that's right. I'm talking to you specifically. I'm not talking to the other people. I'm talking to you, specifically you. You owe me $100. If you make $100 a month and you're supposed to pay me $100 at the end of the month, that's a lot of money, right? That would feel like a lot of money. It would be hard for you to pay it back. It would be almost impossible maybe for you to pay it back. You'd have to make big sacrifices. That's, in that situation, $100 is a lot of money. However, let's say that that's right, again, you owe me $1,000 at the end of the month. However, you make $100,000 a month. In that situation, you're like, I owe Robert $1,000. It's not really that big of a deal. I got $100,000 hanging around. I can just toss him $1,000, and then I could toss him $2,000 and just be like, cheers, thanks. You know what I'm saying? $1,000 is more than $100. However, if you're the person who owes $1,000 but you're making $100,000, you're in a better position relative to the person that owes $100 but only makes $100. The numbers are bigger in the 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 situation. However, relative to the $100 to $100 example, those numbers are not bigger. And that's what you got to look at. You got to think of it and look at it relative to other situations. So, the way we do that with the federal budget and the federal debt and the federal deficit is we look at these things as a percentage of GDP. Okay? This allows us to take into account things like inflation. Remember how a hamburger costs like 20 cents back in the day, and now it costs $1 or $6 or $7, depending on where you go. That's because of inflation. If the federal government ran a deficit of $20 billion in 1960, that is in no way the same thing as the federal government running a federal deficit of $20 billion today. It might actually be equivalent to the federal government running a deficit of like $200 billion or $300 billion today. So, we like to look at it as a percentage of GDP. The GDP is the amount of money the economy produces overall. We just think of it simply in those terms. The GDP is the total income of the country, the amount of stuff the country produces. Okay? We look at all of these numbers as a percentage of that GDP. So, 2016 as a percentage of GDP. The federal government is going to spend roughly 21.2% of GDP. Okay, so it's going to spend roughly $4 trillion, which is roughly 22.2% of GDP. It's going to take in roughly 18.3% of GDP. The total deficit is going to be 2.9% of GDP, and the debt is going to be roughly 75% of GDP. Remember, the deficit is that year-to-year figure, while the total debt is that overall figure. So, comparing that to averages over the past 40 years or so, over the past 40 years, the federal government has, on average, spent 20.3% of GDP. If this year we're spending 21.2% of GDP, that means we're pretty close to the 40-year average, right? Even though we're spending $4 trillion this year, and maybe 40 years ago we only spent $1 trillion, the fact of the matter is the $1 trillion is equal to the $4 trillion this year. You know that because we can look at the percentage of GDP. Revenue, on average, we've been taking in roughly 17.4% of GDP. This year, we'll be taking in roughly 18.3% of GDP. Both of those things are a little higher than the 40-year average, but not much. The deficit, the amount of money we're spending versus the amount of money we're taking in, is 2.9% of GDP for 2016. The average over the past 40 years for the deficit has been 2.9% of GDP. So actually this year, despite the fact that we're going to be spending roughly $500 billion more than we take in, the fact of the matter is, when looking at the years of 14 years ago, is 2000, so 1976. From 1976, from Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush 2, and through Obama's years, we are going to be spending this year, which is essentially the equivalent. We're going to be spending more than we take in revenue, the equivalent of which we've done on average over the past 40 years. Basically, we don't have any historically high budget deficit this year. It's right on line with what our deficit figures have been for the past 40 years. And also, in addition to that, the very next one. Okay, so slide 11, touching on some political controversies. I'm going to do federal deficits first. Are federal deficits high? No. They're actually at 40-year lows. The past 2 years, the federal deficit has been under that 2.9% of GDP figure. For the next 2 years, it looks like it should be under that 2.9 figure also. It'll only be 2019 when that deficit starts to rise again and exceed 2.9% of GDP. But in terms of our historic, sort of modern historic average, Obama, for the past 2 years, and it looks like the United States for the next 2 years, so about, 4 or 5 years altogether, we will be borrowing per year less or right on target with the amount of money that we've averaged over the past 40 years. All right. So federal deficits are not high at the moment. And that's part of the reason why you haven't seen people talk about the federal deficit as much as they were in 2010 and 2011 when the federal deficit was near 10% of GDP. Okay. Social Security. Big one. Social Security has not and will not ever in the history of its entire life add to our federal deficits, nor will it ever in the history of anything ever add to our federal debt. That's not the way Social Security works. Social Security has never done anything to the federal debt and federal deficit. Okay? It is never, and it's not ever designed to ever add anything to the federal debt and federal deficit. The way Social Security works is that it has right now a trust fund because for a very long time it's been taking in more money than it's spent. Over the past couple of years, it's still for the most part taking in more money than it spends, except for I think maybe 2010 or 2011, maybe both those years, it briefly took in less money than it spent. But right now and for the next several years, Social Security will take in more money than it spends, so it'll be running a surplus. However, sometime around 2019 to 2022, in that range, Social Security will start spending more than it takes in. It'll be running a deficit, and then it looks like the deficit will sort of fall, will increase pretty rapidly, and the trust fund will dry up pretty quickly within 10 to 20 years. So, as an example, maybe the first year there's a Social Security deficit, it's like $10 billion. The next year it's $20 billion. The year after that it's $60 billion. The fourth year there's a deficit, it's maybe $150 billion. Then the fifth year it's $400 billion. And then the sixth year is like $800 billion. That's sort of like what I mean by rapidly, that deficit rapidly increases and the trust fund rapidly decreases. Something like that. Okay? But here's the deal. Social Security is entirely self-funded. Those payroll taxes that you pay go to pay for Social Security. when the Social Security Trust Fund runs out, it will not add to the federal debt or the federal deficit. What it will do is that Social Security will start paying out less than it promised. There is no mechanism in there at all for Social Security to borrow money from anywhere else. So roughly what's going to happen is that if nothing changes, if there are no changes to the law, and sometime between 2030 and 2050, somewhere in there, it will vary a lot based upon how the economy goes and things like that. Somewhere within that 20-year period, the Social Security Trust Fund will very, very likely run out, at which point, for the next 75 years, Social Security will be able to pay out 75% of what it promised everybody it would pay out when they were paying into the system. So, let's say when I'm old, it's 40 years from now, and I'm, entering retirement or something. If today Social Security says that it'll give me $1,000 a month, in 40 years it'll really be giving me $750 a month, 75% of what it promised. Okay? Now that's a problem because you want the Social Security to be able to pay out the benefits that it promised everybody to pay when it paid into the system. You wouldn't necessarily want you to have car insurance and then you get into a wreck and the insurance company goes, well, you know what, we're actually kind of having an off year, so I know we promised to give you $1,000, but instead we're just going to give you $750. You'd be like, no, screw that. Give me my $1,000 that I've been paying into this thing that you promised you'd give me. That's going to be the issue with Social Security, not, though, anything to do with the debt or deficit. Okay. I have a chart, federal debt, long-term issue. You can see the federal debt as a percentage of GDP going back to just before World War II. You can see that the federal debt as a percentage of GDP hit about 107 to 110% towards the end of World War II. And then for the next 30 years, federal debt as a percentage of GDP decreased. Now, when you see this line going down, this does not mean that the years where the debt as a percentage of GDP was actually decreasing. As a real number, we've been running federal deficits for the vast majority, if not, well, definitely for the vast majority of years between World War II and today. The federal government pretty much every single year spends more money than it takes in. Why or how then, if it's constantly adding to the debt, does the federal debt as a percentage of GDP decrease over this time, even though the federal government keeps borrowing more and more money? It's because economic growth was faster than the amount of money we were borrowing. So if we borrowed 1% of GDP, but the economy grew by 4% of the previous year's GDP, then we would still be adding money to the federal debt. However, that debt would be, as a percentage of the overall total, less. I hope this makes some sense. If you look, we've been on an increase since roughly 1980. We had a little bit of a crest up when we had the energy crisis, and we started getting involved in, or we were sort of ramping down Vietnam, actually. Excuse me. Energy crisis, recession, we started to have a little bit of a increase. We had a lot of inflation during the mid-70s. During Carter's last years, we actually start to see the percentage of debt as a percentage of GDP decrease. And then really the modern sort of increase in debt really took hold under Reagan. And we started having large deficits, growth in federal deficits that outpaced growth in GDP, which is why we have within 10 years we go from about you go from about 25% to 40% of GDP, roughly. We have a recession in the early 90s, which then further increases the deficit as a percentage of GDP. Then we have the technology boom of the mid and late 90s, and the GDP was running so hot, was increasing so much, and for about 3 of those years, we actually had a federal government surplus, which is why the debt as a percentage of GDP tanked for a couple of years. And then after 2000, we see this small increase, and then it levels off, and then the Great Recession hits, and as we would expect, the debt as a percentage of GDP spikes way high up. If you notice, for the past couple of years, we've actually had the debt as a percentage of GDP decrease, which is a very good thing. While we've been continuing deficits, that debt as a percentage of GDP is actually going down. However, nobody expects that trend to continue. And when we get into the, probably in the next 3 years or less, we'll start seeing that percentage of federal debt to GDP increase. So the federal debt is a long-term issue. Roughly today it's about 75% of GDP. Okay? One of the big things that's going to be driving that increase in the federal debt is interest on servicing the debt. So right now, people are loaning America money at like 0% interest. People are basically giving America free money because we're the safest place in the world to put money. This is a very good thing, and we should probably be using this to our advantage, but we're not, so whatever. However, because our economy is not projected to grow that much, however, we're expected to start seeing interest rates rise in the next few years. That only means that the amount of money we're going to pay in interest on the debt is going to increase, and within the next 10 years or so, we're paying roughly $200 to $300 billion a year right now on interest on the federal debt. We'll be paying around $900 to $1 trillion a year on interest on the federal debt, and that's a lot of money. Here's the sort of real problem with that, is that when we have a high debt to GDP ratio, it constrains the federal government's ability to respond to future crises. So the system worked pretty much exactly how it was supposed to work in response to the Great Recession. The economy tanked, but the federal government spending increased, and it kicked in to help stabilize the economy. Okay, before we had these automatic stabilizers, America went through Great Depressions every 20 years or so. Since then, though, we've had almost 80 years of nearly uninterrupted, except for a couple of recessions, small recessions, growth until 2008, 2009. We're in an okay situation right now. However, let's say there's another Great Recession in the next 5 years, and we haven't sort of done much to make sure that we've buttressed ourselves. Okay, we're going to see that debt as a percentage of GDP increase again a lot. It'll probably get up to World War II levels. So 100, 110% of GDP. When that happens, if we don't start seeing that federal debt as a percentage of GDP start decreasing quickly, it'll make it very, 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 very hard for the government to respond to additional economic instability or military instability, trade instability, things like that. Think of it, right now we have like $5 or $6 trillion, maybe $7 trillion of cushion. If something very bad were to happen, we've got about $7 trillion that we can borrow to solve whatever that problem is. Okay? If we sort of use up that $7 trillion through not doing anything about the debt, and we might use that up within the next 30 years or so, if China and Russia decide to attack America in 2050 and our federal debt is 110% of GDP, it gets a little more difficult for the United States to respond to that threat. We have less room in the budget to do so. If you want a little bit of yay though, Japan's at 200% of GDP. They have twice as much debt as they make as a country in a year. But they're still okay. I mean, they're not great, but we're not talking about an economy that's collapsing necessarily, right? Greece, one of the reasons Greece happened, Greece has debt at approximately 140% of GDP. But the reason Greece happened is because they don't have control over their own monetary supply. They require other countries. They are part of the EU, and the EU as a whole controls the euro. It gets into currency situations. It's a little more complicated. The United States, as long as it maintains control over its currency, we're not ever going to become Greece. But that doesn't mean it won't be more expensive and more difficult for us in the future to respond to crises. And that's the real concern, but we've got a while to fix it. And we should probably be planning for the next 30 years instead of looking at trying to solve it in the next 2 years. That would only cause trouble. So is this a solvable problem? Yes, it is. We can increase taxes, which will help reduce the federal deficit and then also reduce the percentage of debt compared to GDP. We could engage in spending cuts, which theoretically should do the same thing. If we invest in a way that creates a lot of robust economic growth, even if we spend more money and if we increase the deficit each year, as long as we got good economic growth that is larger than the increase in the yearly debt, the yearly deficit, then we're good, we're square. If we have 5%, deficits every single year, but we have 6% growth in GDP, good. We can do with that. We can live, we can go. Hooray. 3% deficit GDP looks pretty good for us because, at least nominally, GDP increases in general more than that. Not in real terms, but we're looking at nominal terms. Something else though. But so we can either spend more money in smart ways that produce a lot of economic growth. We could cut spending, which can be risky because cutting spending actually also reduces economic growth. We can increase taxes, which can also be tricky because it can, depending on how they're targeted, decrease economic growth. But there are different ways we can solve this problem. One of the big issues to get, though, is that Social Security and the federal debt are separate issues and not really related to each other, at least not directly related to each other. If we fix Social Security, that does nothing for the federal debt or federal deficit issue. Nothing, nada, zero, never, ever, nothing. It doesn't do anything. You can forget the idea that if you solve Social Security, you fix the federal debt. No bearing at all whatsoever. Just zap it from your mind if you thought that. It never, ever would. And in general, I would say that if you fix the debt, you are not solving Social Security. Forget that. Put it out of your mind forever and ever and always. It's never going to happen forever, ever. Solving the debt does not fix Social Security, except unless one little tiny thing happens. They tweak the law, or they just decide to funnel money from the federal budget and the debt that they're no longer sort of growing to Social Security, but that's not going to happen. So just cut that out of your brain forever and always. Separate issues. Separate problems, separate issues forever. Okay? If we can work together as one nation and just adopt my ideas over the next 10 to 15 years, everything will be perfect. Again, it's something that we have some time to fix. Every year we don't fix it, we have less time to fix. We're getting closer to the point of no return, but we're not there yet. And every year we don't work to fix the federal debt and the Social Security issue. That means that if we want to fix it in the future, we'll have to take more drastic action. Maybe a quick analogous example is climate change. If we would have started working on solving climate change when people were first like, whoa, this is going to be a huge problem, in 1988, when we had that first testimony to Congress in 1988, we could have slowly and gradually, without any major disruptions, fixed the issue. However, we've gotten to the point where we might be at the point of no return. If we're not at the point of no return right now, if we haven't already passed the point of no return, it's in the next couple of years. Which means we're going to have to make, if we want to truly fix the climate issue, huge and drastic changes in the way we produce energy. Massive, massive investments in the way we fix this thing. Drastic, hardcore changes. We don't have to do that if we can start working on Social Security and the debt now. But that's not going to happen, so start investing in rice. and Campbell's soup, and I guess get some guns and a shack in the middle of the woods, and get yourself some cows and chickens, and get prepared for the apocalypse. Cool deal. I'll see y'all later.